Okay, everybody, looks like we're getting the live stream up and running here, and hopefully everything's all set. Thanks so much for joining me on a Tuesday afternoon. Again, I'm trying to kind of bring these live streams to make them a little more consistent. One thing I do plan on going over in tonight's live stream is just a basic overview of a number of the statewide races. I had intended to actually do a video this week, and I got most of it scripted, just couldn't quite put the last part of it together, so I'm going to have to use the live stream here a little bit as my substitute to talk about some of the races and the candidates that are on the ballot here. So it'll be a little more loosey-goosey, but it should be still probably a good way at least to discuss some of the races for those of you who have procrastinated until the last week of having your ballots in hand. So hopefully this will be somewhat helpful for you as well. Just to remind everybody, this is an Ask Me Anything video, which means that down below I will feature the question that I'm attempting to ask if I haven't gone entirely off the subject, and whichever question is posted up there, that's what I'll have posted down below, and then as I answer that, or at least think I've partially answered it, I'll move on. Totally okay if you want to use the comment section to chat back and forth with each other. Just try to use the @WeTheGoverned with an actual question. I will try to pick out the questions as I go along. There is a lot of commentary, cross commentary that tends to pop up, so I'll just have to pick and choose as we go along. One thing too, real quick, I am going to be, if you happen to be in San Juan County at the Lincoln Day dinner, I'm the MC there August 9th. It's out in Roach Harbor. So just a few days actually after the primary, so it should be next week, and I think I'll be doing some speaking out there as well, and possibly another event while I'm up there in the islands. It's always a good day to be in the San Juans. I love going up there, and a lot of friends in the San Juans. I've been going there since I was a kid, and it's just very fun to be able to do that and meet with people who are trying to make a difference where they live up there. I did a video today, a little different format that'll be launching later this week, probably tomorrow, I would guess. That just basically is my kind of some top 10 things that I've noticed, just crazy wokester stuff, and just some bizarre things that have happened around the country and in our state lately. And I don't know why, I was just kind of in that mood driving down, so I decided I'd prep up that video and probably spend a little too much time on that and not enough on my candidate recommendation videos. So we'll just substitute today's Ask Me Anything for part of that time. I'll probably talk about some of the candidates as we go along here. So there's a bunch of questions that have already popped up, so we'll start just getting into it here. And then if it gets a little slow, I might jump out and then try to cover some of these statewide races. And I can see that there's some people in here already asking questions about some of the races on your ballot. So we'll just get into it here pretty quick. The one thing I'm going to point out is, based on my contacts at various county auditor offices around the state, and just the information that we're looking at, tracking year-over-year comparisons on the volume of ballots that are coming in, which you can actually do. You can, it's not a secret how many ballots have been received by the auditor's offices. And so you can kind of get a sense of what that volume is this year compared to other presidential years, and you have to kind of compare it to other presidential years because there is a 4-year and kind of a 2-year cycle that occurs with vote volume comparisons for primaries. And the numbers as a percentage right now look relatively low. So from a turnout model standpoint, the question is always going to be what that whether that means that Republican voters are a little depressed, Democrat voters are a little depressed, both of them are a little depressed. I don't know. So I don't know I don't have enough data yet to know which category, but the overall volume of ballots that are coming in seems to be a little lower with most contacts that I have with various auditors around the state. So it's always possible you'll get a surge of ballots kind of coming in at the end, but frankly, at this point in time, for those people who are going to vote, probably well over half those people have already filled out their ballots, whether they've actually mailed them in or not. They might just be sitting on the kitchen counter or in the seat of their car. I remember doing that years ago and then forgetting. This was many years ago, but I remember I had it filled out and it got covered by other things. I found it, weeks after the election was done, which happens sometimes. So when you're wondering why people tell you to send the ballot in, because they're worried about that and they know that that happens a lot. So anyway, let's get into it. Next Tuesday, a week from today, is going to be election night, and a lot of things are going to be going on there. So first question that I have here is from Pablo Cruz down below. Is there any organization that is uniting people across Cascadia to inform the natives and fight back against the downward spiral of the progressive movement? I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you'd really necessarily describe that. When you say inform the natives, I'm assuming you're just talking about people who live in Washington, not specifically using that term for, the 19 different recognized tribes in Washington state. I'm not sure what you're 100% talking about. But as far as uniting people on a common ground against some of the craziness that the left has brought to the state, there's probably a number of different groups of people that are trying to do that. Some people are trying to do that individually. Some are probably doing that in a more locally organized way. I don't know if there's necessarily a formal group around that's not politically or overtly political in nature that might be pushing back on that. So I'm not really clear that there's a great organization to refer you to or even mention. PJ, you got a question here about, can you go over your pick for senator? I hear Garcia is good. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of people running for federal Senate seat. Maria Cantwell's the incumbent who's running for office. Last I checked, what was it, on the FEC website, she had raised like $11 million. She had about $7 million still left in her account. The only other candidate that's even remotely in the ballpark of being serious running for office is Raul Garcia, Dr. Raul Garcia to be specific. And he's raised like $500,000, give or take. Now, people oftentimes ask, why am I using the metric of how much money they've raised? That shouldn't matter. But you got to look at objective measurements that you can have about political campaigns that are an indication that something's actually going on there. Just for running a statewide race where you're going to have 4 million people potentially somewhere in that ballpark sending in ballots to vote, and you've raised $5,000, you have no practical or realistic way to reach even a microscopic percentage of the people who you're expecting to actually send in, put your name down on the ballot. Now, if you filled out your voter's guide information as a candidate, that at least gets somewhat distributed around the state. The distribution of the voter's guide seems to be getting worse and worse every year, so I'm not sure every election cycle. A lot of complaints this year that they haven't sent it out to enough people yet, and it's obviously too late now for the primary. Either you got it already or you didn't. But they do have an online version that you can go look at. That's probably, that's everybody gets that. So that's your best communication that you're going to have as a political candidate. But after that, there's a small percentage of people that actually use a voter's guide. We wish it was more, but there's a small percentage. So let's just say you got 15% of the voting population that actually looks at the voter's guide and makes their decision based on that. And it could be higher, but I suspect it's probably not too much higher than that. So how are they going to know who you are? You're going to need to raise money, and you raise money so that you can market yourself. That's what the money's used for. It should be used for that. So signs, brochures, maybe mailers, maybe ads on TV or radio or some other way to get your name out there. Name familiarity is a big part of running for political office. Shouldn't be a surprise. No different than selling, Twinkies or McDonald's burgers, right? People need to know about it, and if they don't know that you exist, they won't vote for you. Not a surprise, but it seems to be shocking to most people when they hear that's how most people are going to look at these things. So Raul Garcia is probably the only other legitimate candidate who's serious running for the federal Senate seat against Marie Cantwell. Insiders are going to view that as still kind of a long shot case, but he's run a legitimate campaign. He's raised significant money. $500,000 isn't. It's not so much that you would feel like he's going head to head with her. He clearly isn't. But it is enough to get his name out there. And frankly, what they're trying to do is they're going to see how the primary numbers roll out. Any Republican running for statewide office that's able to get above 45%, especially if they're able to get around the 48% range, that changes things dramatically on how big money tends to look at, or even the media or anybody else, how they tend to look at that race. That means you're in contention. If you get 41% and in the primary, then most insiders aren't going to pay much attention to you, and something crazy is going to have to happen for you to break out of that or to change things. So that's just going to be how they look at it. Good question. Thank you for asking about that one. PJ Finster, another question related to the political process. Your pick for Commissioner of Public Lands. So I'm going to go, this is an interesting race because you essentially have, I don't remember if it was 8 or 9 people running for office, but it really boils down to four practical campaigns that are being run across the political spectrum. On the far left side, you have Dave Upthgrove, who's King County councilman who's running. By King County standards, I think he had tried to portray himself over time as a little bit more moderate than some of the crazier Democrat socialist kind of crazies that have come into office, because they did, the socialists tried to remove him from office in a recent election cycle, and he survived it. But according to his own writings, he survived it because Republicans ended up supporting him over the super crazy socialist that was running against him at the time. Now, that being said, now that he's running for Commissioner of Public Lands, he's kind of tacking even far left, and he had to do that in the early days of the campaign when there were some other more left-leaning Saldana, for example, who was still in the race. Now, she dropped out. I made a mistake in one of my live streams where I said she was still in the race, but she'd actually dropped out before filing week in May. And it was because Dave Upthgrove kind of went to the left of her and got all of the greenie kind of enviro groups to support him, and with their endorsements and all their money, that kind of allowed him to squeeze out everybody on the left, and so he's kind of occupied that space. You have another Democrat running, Kevin Vandeweghe, who's a representative out there in the 24th Ledge District, and he's going for it. And I actually like Kevin Vandeweghe. I know he's a Democrat, and I disagree with him on a bunch of things. But when it comes to the policies that he would promote and use, or at least that he claims that he would support in the public lands, it's much more in line with what most of us would want. Reasonable forest management, prescribed burning, proper, just doing a better job managing the forests so they don't just become big forest fire incubators moving forward, which is the left-leaning plan for our forests in Washington, is to make sure that they're structured to give maximum destruction when they do catch on fire eventually. So instead of preemptively managing them properly, it's about just letting them become a tinderbox. And he's against that, and I appreciate that. Actually, I was on a conference call with him just a few weeks ago. I think it was at the Farm Bureau, and it was just really interesting hearing him talk, and we were talking about the policies. He probably has some pretty good policies. The problem for him is that those are the two Democrats in the race, and Upthgrove is going to get all the left-leaning support, and that's going to probably squeeze Vandeweghe out, even if it's most likely going to happen. So he's got a narrow lane to try to run on. You have two Republicans in the race, Sue Peterson and Jamie Herrera Butler. So Sue Peterson's ran before, 4 years ago. She's actually the endorsed candidate by the Republicans statewide, but she hasn't raised a lot of money. And she's had a hard time just campaigning around the state, other than the party endorsement, which definitely helped her get her name out there. I love Sue. I've known her for a number of years. Love her policies. But if you don't have that much money in your campaign, it's very difficult to get the word out. Jamie Herrera Butler is a former congresswoman where I live in the 3rd Congressional District. And she was bounced out of office a couple years ago. And so now she's running for Public Lands Commissioner. In full, truth and disclosure here, in my opinion, I actually think that if you had Sue Peterson, Jamie Herrera Butler, or Kevin Vandeweghe, all three of them would be massive. Any of those three would be a huge improvement over how the Public Lands office has been run, which is mostly dealing with Department of Natural Resources, the forest land, right, the managing the shellfish lands in a lot of the Puget Sound area and out in Willapa Bay. And particularly with the trust lands that have been set aside for income-producing lands for schools, where they lease a lot of those lands in eastern Washington to farming operations. It was one of the things that people don't realize, or I should say people are less familiar with, when the state was formed. A lot of the public lands were set aside in sections for supporting schools, the public school system. It was originally designed to help fund school buildings, which it did for many decades, until the spotted owl and a variety of other programs that kicked in the 80s and 90s pretty much destroyed that income stream and then shifted the burden more onto property owners. Longer conversation there, but any of those three people would actually do a pretty good job. Now, some people don't like Jamie Herrera Butler because she voted to impeach Trump, so she's alienated a large portion of the Republican base, which is why at the Republican convention she didn't get the endorsement and Sue Peterson did. But she's raised a lot of money and seems to be running a pretty serious campaign. So if you were to ask insiders, political insiders, the general assumption, and we'll know next week if this is right or wrong, is that Jamie Herrera Butler probably gets out of the primary and Dave Upthgrove probably get out of the primary. Probably. And if it's a face-off between those two, Jamie Herrera Butler is clearly the better one. If for some reason it's Sue Peterson that gets through instead, she's the better one. If somehow it's a strange combination and Van de Weg gets a lot more Republican votes than I would ever expect him to get, and it's the two of them, Van de Weg's still the better choice. So it's going to be some combination. I guarantee Upthgrove's coming through. I would presume that Jamie Herrera Butler comes through, and that's your battle going into the general election. But we're in desperate need in that department just to get somebody in there that's actually sane and not completely crazy. I will point out that both with Goldmark and with Hillary Franz, who were the previous two public lands commissioners here, that they both went in there on this crazy, aggressive, green, let's destroy the forest kind of agenda. That's not what they called it, but essentially that's what it functionally became. And once they got into office, they tended not to govern quite as extreme as they sold themselves on. And so in both cases, the Enviro community and the aggressive kind of Green New Deal folk always kept coming. They kept attacking. They would support them, they'd get them in, and then they'd attack them for not being aggressive enough at making the forest burn down even more, or whatever their hope and plans were. So it's just kind of interesting to track that. Sorry, that was a little bit longer conversation than I expected to have on that one. The next question here is Thunderstriker. Also, I believe Kamala would win and DEI initiatives would remain intact. However, there might be significant changes or controversies regarding employment policies in 2025. Your thoughts? This almost sounds like a partial question that you might have had something else before it, but in Washington State, I would anticipate that Kamala Harris would win Washington State. I would. Yeah, it doesn't. Even if she loses nationally as presidential candidate, Washington State's not considered a battleground state for a lot of good reasons. I haven't seen any real survey data between the two of them yet, but I would presume that Kamala would, at this point in time, all things being equal, probably look more likely as a candidate to succeed in Washington than Trump. That's what I would anticipate. If she did win, obviously DEI would be in full force, and diversity, equity, inclusion, which is just another way about destroying merit and making sure that you downgrade the quality of everything. But in the way that it gets implemented, it's a complete disaster every time it's tried. So I'm sure if she did win, it would get bad. David, not a question, but good day from Washougal, always a good day, and I'm not that far away from Washougal right now. Jack, have you noticed, I'm assuming that's the word you meant, how many people only care about the presidential election, totally clueless about their state elections and how they really affect them? Completely agree with you. It's been a common concern that I've had over the years. I've brought this up for 15 years, I think now. Your ability to make an impact in the presidential race is pretty small in comparison to your ability to make an impact with local races at the statewide level even, and then, of course, even more impactful as you get closer to home, school districts, city councils, things like that. So it is kind of funny, and partially it's this cult of personality that tends to develop around politicians. A lot of people seem to put politicians up on a pedestal like that and really obsess about them and their personalities. And the truth is, running for office, you do create a personality around your campaign and the candidate who's running. And you can't really totally avoid that. And if it's a good personality or one that's dynamic in some way, you're able to bring more people in. If it's a bad personality, then you have to try to hide it or downgrade it in some way. But if you care about how things are going in your community, 9 times out of 10, the policies that you want to change can be changed. and significantly impacted much more dramatically by local government elections. And frequently those races are ignored with very low voter participation or awareness, and getting just 3 or 4 people even mobilized to fight for that city council seat or that county commission race or even your local legislative race can make a huge, huge difference in outcomes. And people won't put the time into that, even though it's more impactful in the day-to-day life than anything they could ever do on the presidential side of things. So good point, Jack. Thanks for bringing it up. You're preaching you're preaching the choir with me, and hopefully I'm sharing that with everybody else. Realistically, does Harris even have a fighting chance of winning? And what factors would influence her prospects? Nationally, I actually think she's a pretty weak candidate, mainly because in her own primary, not that long ago, it was only 4 years ago, a little less, even the Democrats didn't like her that much. But you also, again, you have the situation where you got a pretty strong machine on the left, and it's more than the Democrat Party. I think people oftentimes assign too much value to the parties, both parties, but particularly the Democrat Party is certainly more organized and has more money and more resources, but mainly it's because they weaponize government to reward themselves a lot more effectively than the Republicans typically do when they get into office. So, and part of that's corruption, and part of that's just a willingness to use government differently. Whereas on the Republican side, there's a much stronger leaning, not enough of it, but there's a stronger leaning to be more libertarian, leave us alone, and shrink the size of government, or at least get it out of our lives. So Republicans tend to be more, they're more reluctant, I should say, to use government to abuse you. So Harris has a chance. I think Harris is a weak candidate in a lot of ways, and a weak person. That will give the Republicans an opportunity to prevail. I usually never discount the ability of Republicans to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, since that seems to be just a cultural thing for the Republican Party. But it really depends on whether she blows up and cackles too much in public or becomes that super obnoxious person that we all know her to be. If people become more aware of that, then that's going to be part of what drives her away. I mentioned cult of personality just a little while ago. Personalities matter, but they mostly matter on the negative side, right? You want to have a personality that's not a lot of people have a personality that's so good that by its personality you're gaining a bunch of votes there. What you really want to do, at least, is for political candidates, avoid a personality that's so bad you're losing a bunch of votes and you turn a bunch of people off. And I think she's got that type of personality that actually tends to turn more people off. Just look at the turnover in her staff. All staff reports up until a month ago were that she was the worst person anybody had ever worked for. She had massive staff turnover. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with her for whatever reasons and policies or personality usually that she has. It's driving people away. John Jacobson, great question here. Good local one here. Please comment on Inslee's lame $200 rebate to PSE customers just in time for the election. Think how much we have all paid out at the pump in his carbon tax. And frankly, you paid more than that in your increased Puget Sound energy bill too. This is just, these are, the politicians think you're morons, right? They just think we all are. After all, we voted for them. And so that general attitude that we're all just a bunch of idiots tends to play into their kind of soft bribery schemes that they want to throw out there. It's the bread and circuses idea of Rome, where, if you just throw people bread, they'll get distracted by it and not pay attention to the fact that society's collapsing around them, right? That's kind of the theory here. And so because math isn't really taught anymore, and they assume that most people are dumb and not aware of, or at least ignorant of math, at any basic level, they think that $200, hey, here's our rebate to you for being, it's their way to try, please don't vote, to repeal all of it and reduce your costs by $1,200 a year, right? And they're just hoping that that's what people will do. So it's classic. Let's see, PSE, Jamie, thanks, this is a good question. PSE makes you sign up for the assisted program. It's not a one-time deal as far as I can see. Yeah, that's a different issue though. There's a bribery short-term program that Inslee's trying to work with Puget Sound Energy on, and then there's a long-term assistance program that's actually been around for a long time. Let's see, Jet Vet. Being we must choose a political party in Washington State, do you know how many Democrat versus Republicans there are registered to date statewide, I'm assuming. We actually don't register people here by party at all, and we haven't since 1934. We're actually one of the few states, probably one of the longest running states, that doesn't register by party. Here's where you think that you're being registered by party, which is that there's a party identification that people have to choose in the presidential primary process, because they're partisan primaries, and there's only 2 partisan primaries that we have in Washington State, Republican and Democrat. Those are the 2 major parties. And so when you do that, you are picking by which, presumably you're picking by which party that you vote in, that you're Republican or you're Democrat. Now, here's where that model gets thrown out, is that if you have a year where there's not much competition in one party's primary, but there's a lot of competition in the other, people will quote unquote shift over and vote in just that party primary to mess up the results. I mean, Rush Limbaugh, I talked about this years ago when there was a 2008 race, I think, with Hillary Clinton and Obama about Operation Chaos right back then. And so a ton of Republicans voted in the Democrat primaries, and vice versa. You've seen it happen in states like Washington where you can do that. You've seen it happen a lot. So what you have is a lot of people who claim that they're independents in Washington. So that's, you probably have a much larger segment of the population that claim they're independent. And I've seen all kinds of models, and everybody thinks they can dig down and dive into it and figure out exactly what the party affiliation is of all those independents. You're probably better off you can categorize them as leaning Republican or leaning Democrat. And the shift in any political race or control for a big state tends to be when the middle like that shifts into one column or another, right? That's how you have some of that shift that occurs. And the next person mentioned the same thing. Do you know how many registered? I think that's the same question that we had before, but there's no real clarity as to what that percentage would be. On average, if you look at maybe the last 20 years of statewide elections, with exceptions periodically, which are very, coming back to personality, impacted by politicians or campaigns that are very specifically done, you're going to see there's probably a 55-45 split most of the time, Democrat versus Republican, but it closes the gap in a variety of policies. When it comes to tax increases, Washingtonians tend to be about 51 to 55% opposed to most tax increases in Washington. So there's a fiscal, get off my back and stop stealing money from me kind of attitude that prevails, especially in the middle area, where some people might call themselves Democrat on some policies, but they'd shift over and be more fiscally conservative on others. It always happens. There's another choice to consider, RFK Jr. Sure there is. Yeah, you got some other presidential primaries. Jill Stein, I think, is running in our state, and there's, I think, a couple others. But there's, none of those candidates, the only thing that's interesting about those campaigns, essentially, at least from a Washington State perspective, is just how many votes, who they take votes away from. And actually, that's a good question with RFK Jr. I think he takes away votes from both Harris and Trump at the presidential level. Jill Stein probably just takes away votes from Harris that would otherwise go to her. So we'll just see how that goes. Jet Vet, this is a good question. In the 5th Congressional District, as I've mentioned before, and I know I've made a couple of misstatements on this race, 5th Congressional District is essentially the far eastern Washington Republican-leaning district that includes Spokane. So it's basically, if you were to take Washington and split it in thirds, it's the furthest third. It's closest to Idaho. And it is a Republican, it has been a Republican congressional seat since, I believe, 1994. But Kathy Morris Rogers had been in there since, I think, 2004, if I remember right. Hopefully I'm right on that, about 20 years. And so she kind of suddenly decided that she was going to retire. And that's a big change because you have a new open seat. So a ton of Republicans, 10 in originally, but now it winnowed itself down to, I think, 6 who are staying on the final battle here. Now, the interesting thing is there's 4 Democrats running. And it kind of depends on how we're going to see in a week. But Michael Baumgartner's running for that seat. He was the former state senator out there in that district. or one of those ledge districts out there, and he was also the county treasurer. He's been in office and he's been elected in Spokane, and he's raised a ton of money. And so of all of them, he's probably presumed to be the front runner. Now, you also have former Ferry County Commissioner out there who is also who's a Republican endorsed candidate. Now I'm blanking on his name. I'm sorry. Oh, it kills me. I hate doing that when I'm live stream. There's no way for me to quickly look it up. But Dan Danzel. I believe that he's Brian Danzel. So Brian Danzel was the Republican nominee at their state convention for that district. He hasn't raised as much money. Started to raise a little bit more now. You also had a local legislator out of the 7th Legislative District, Jacqueline Maycumber, who's been in Republican leadership in Olympia for a while. And those are kind of the 3 Republicans who were duking it out. I don't know which. I mean, I would say that by the numbers, by the surveys, there's sort of a sense that Michael Baumgartner's probably in the lead, but any of those 3 Republicans seem to be the 3 that are, positioning themselves to come out of this top 2 primary scrum. The interesting thing is there may be enough support for 2 of them that it's got the potential, anyway, that if the Democrats are split up amongst their other candidates, and I haven't read anything that clearly defines how they're split up there, you have a potential where you could get 2 Republicans through the primary and squeeze out the Democrats just because of the way they might split their votes. However, it's always been a pipe dream on the Republican side. They did it once in 2016 with the state treasurer's office, but they haven't pulled that trifecta out of their hat in any competitive race anytime since. So I would assume the Democrats get behind one of their candidates and push them over the top, and then the Republicans are kind of fighting to see who comes out of this mix. I don't know. It's one of the hard things. It's very difficult unless you have a lot of, Brian Danzel's been back in D.C. He was part of the Trump administration. But he didn't go out and raise the same kind of money that Baumgartner or Maycumber did in that race. And that sets you up for a challenge in the ability to communicate, because Ferry County is one of the smaller counties in that district, and he's going to be well known there because he was a county commissioner and a popular one as far as I can tell while he was there. Maycumber is slightly behind him in the sense that she's going to have better name recognition. She's traveled around and done a pretty good job, I think, speaking in events, and a lot of people know her, and she was in the Republican leadership in Olympia in the caucus. But her district was the northeast part of that congressional district. And again, congressional districts are much bigger than ledge districts for the state. Baumgartner probably has a little bit of a lead because he's been elected in Spokane County already, and that's the biggest county in that district by a long ways. So the large percentage of the voters are going to be already familiar with him. And he's got a lot of money, and he's run an aggressive campaign. At this point in time, and from my perspective, I just want a Republican to come out of that race because I don't want to lose seats in D.C. So we'll just see who's able to survive the scrum here. I would love to see 2 Republicans come out of the race. That would even be more enjoyable for me, and then you could really really compare the 2 different people. But at this point in time, it's just up to whoever runs a decent campaign. They're probably fairly close. Not a great help for you because I don't live in that district, and I haven't spent a ton of time diving into the nuances. I do know these candidates, and I generally like them overall. Personally, I get along with all 3 of them, actually, but I don't necessarily know who's going to come out of the primary. It's hard to know. What machines, Karen, Kyle, what machines are used here in Washington? Karen, I'm assuming when you say that, you're talking about the voter machine system. It isn't Dominion. Dominion's used in one county, which is in Franklin County. Most of the bigger counties use what's called clear ballot, if that's the question you're asking. And mostly they're county machines. The one thing to remember in Washington is because we are all mail-in voting, there's very little electronic voting. It's not like Georgia or some of these other states on the East Coast where they have electronic voting machines. You fill the paper out. The question is, does the paper get read correctly when you feed it through the other machines? Which is why you have observers and which is why you do hand recounts on a periodic basis to verify. we don't do enough of them, but I've been involved in 17, I think 20 hand recounts now. Generally, I have not found problems there. I have other problems with the voting system, but that's a little different than that. Will there be concerns or accusations about potential voter fraud or irregularities in ballot handling in places like Atlanta and Pennsylvania? Of course there will. There has been for 40 years. So I know people just woke up yesterday and thought that suddenly, for the first time in electoral history in America, that 2020 was the first time that we've ever had questions about elections. It was the weirdest set of circumstances behind elections, and there was a lot more red flags thrown up by some of the strange things that were done during the 2020 election all over the place. But it's hardly the first time, and it won't be the last, that accusations or concerns or problems about that will arise. The one benefit that we have coming out of 2020 is that there have been probably tens of thousands of people now more educated about the voting process than there ever were before. There's a lot of people paying attention to a lot of different ways that people might commit fraud, and there's probably a lot of traps that have been set out there essentially to try to catch people and organizations that might be trying to commit vote fraud. Don't presume the parties are the ones that you're trying, the political parties are where it's at as far as trying to solve those problems. Most of these solutions tend to be done outside of that framework, but we'll see. We'll just see where it goes from there. Oakwell, 1st Battalion, after talking with Sue Peterson in 2020, talking about the Public Lands Commissioner here, I came to realize she has a lot of knowledge on forest practices. She absolutely does. She's the most knowledgeable person out there. Listen, if I was Jamie Herrera Butler, and I prevailed in the primary, and it looked like I was going to had a chance of winning, I would hire Sue Peterson because she's clearly capable, knowledgeable. I love her for this. She is one of the most knowledgeable people out there. But again, you rarely elect the person that's the most knowledgeable person for the position they're running. It just doesn't happen that often. So anyway, that's all there is to say about it. Sue, if you're watching this, I love you. I wish you the best of everything. And I think we've even talked before about the disparity in funding between Herrera Butler's campaign versus yours. However, Peterson's got a good chance with the party endorsement is probably giving her a lot of wind in her sails. But the question will be just how does that overcome the other rate? It's hard to know. We'll see. We're only a couple days away from that. Again, either one of those people would be a huge improvement. Let me talk about a couple other races real quick, though, before we go too much longer into this, because I did mention that I was going to talk about some of the other campaigns that are out there. Let's talk about lieutenant governor, for example. The lieutenant governor race, you got an incumbent, Denny Heck, who's raised a ton of money, and he's been in there not that long. He's only been there for 4 years, but he's got a massive political history, right? He's 8 years in Congress in the 10th congressional district. He ran TVW, which he kind of got as a favor in the early 80s after he got out of the state legislature. Longtime political guy. A smart operator overall. People, I may disagree with Danny Heck, and I do, on probably almost every policy that he has, but I recognize somebody who's probably a fairly, got some wisdom, a little bit old school wisdom in running for political office and navigating the minefield of the Democrat Party. You're rarely going to ever see him come out and say something completely crazy or completely exceptionally stupid. I think Denny Heck is fairly careful, and he's going to husband his money and resources. He can raise a lot of money, and he's going to be pretty serious, I think, about running a campaign that's quiet, focused, and probably doesn't have a lot of drama. There's 2.5 Republicans, to be fair, that are running in that race. There's Dan Matthews, and who's from up north and in Skagit County, and who has run for Congress, I believe, in the 1st congressional district. I'm hoping I'm getting that right. And there's also Bob Hageland, who's the former Snohomish County Republican chair, and he's been district chair for the Republican Party up there a couple times. And both Dan and Hageland are the Republicans. I say 2.5 Republicans because there's another candidate who calls himself a liberal Republican out of Oak Harbor who's running for that position. And so he's about half a Republican. I don't know what he really stands for. I've read a couple statements he's had. I just don't know the guy. But anybody that makes that change, whenever you add a modifier to your political affiliation, you pretty much just put yourself in a box that nobody's going to vote for you. I know everybody thinks they have some kind of super secret sauce way of identifying themselves so that voters are going to come out and vote for them. That's not going to work. There's another Democrat that's running as well. The question really is, does Denny Heck get what his numbers are? That's what people would generally be watching for in that race. The two Republicans, Dan Matthews and Bob Hageland, are going to split the Republican vote. One of them will come through. I just don't know for sure who. There's not enough. Neither one of them has enough money to get their name out there very far. They haven't fundraised as much as you would think, so it's very difficult. Nobody's probably done any polling in that race. So I don't know. It's going to be anybody's guess next Tuesday, which of them. And I know both of them. I think they're both good guys running. I don't know anybody else. I know Denny Heck, who's in there right now, as a Democrat. But what Denny's going to be looking at and what the Democrats are going to be looking at and political insiders are going to see what his percentage numbers are. If Denny Heck gets 60% of the vote and everybody else is just playing around the edges, he's going to feel pretty home free, and nobody else is going to be able to raise much money going down to the mat in the lieutenant governor's race. If he gets less than 50%, then he's in trouble, and that's what really starts to shake up that race, and that's what people will be looking for in the results on Tuesday for the lieutenant governor race. Let's talk about another one. Let's talk about OSPI, Office Superintendent of Public Instruction. I did a video on this. There's really only one person in that race who's, conservative at all. You may disagree with them on certain policies, but generally who's got a merit-based and merit-focused sort of experience in education, and that's going to be Dave Olson. I think he's got a really good chance of coming through the primary. But the two Democrats that are duking it out, that part of that race, because essentially it's a three-way race, Reed Saras and Chris Reichel. Chris Reichel's the incumbent OSPI, Office Superintendent of Public Instruction guy. And he's horrible. He's done really a phenomenal job destroying public education and helping encourage tens of thousands of families to pull their kids out of public school and put them into private school or homeschool. Reichel's been really the worst thing that's ever happened to public education in modern state history. And the teachers union loves him for it. It's one of the weirdest, it's particularly the weirdest thing that I've ever seen. What's odd really is Dave Olson is running and has generally been ignored by the two Democrats or clearly affiliated Democrats. I mean, Reichel was a Democrat, legislator for a long time. They're just brutally attacking each other. So Reichel's attacking Reed Saras, Saras is attacking Reichel. And so the big fight during the primary, most likely, is that Dave Olson comes through, and he's a good guy, and I'd recommend people vote for him. But we're really watching to see which of these two Democrats come through. In my opinion, if Saras comes through, he's going to be a much tougher candidate for Dave Olson in the primary or in the general. But Reichel would be a better candidate for Dave Olson to face off with, because some people in the Saras camp are going to be Democrats or more liberal-leaning folk who believe in really radical things like math, that boys are boys and girls are girls, and they can probably identify the difference between the two. They're probably going to believe in merit, high cap programs, things like that. All things that Reichel either doesn't believe in anymore or can't do. And so some of them may be willing to shift over to Dave Olson, who's got a history in the Peninsula school district that's pretty, anybody would be proud of that on the school board. So he's got a really good chance of attracting some percentage of the anti-Chris Reichel vote. If Saras comes through this scrum and takes out Reichel, much tougher race in the general. But for the primary purposes, Dave Olson's an easy choice. Let's look at the insurance commissioner. This race, statewide again, 20-year history with Mike Kreidler in there as the incumbent. Now, he fossilized himself in office as a Democrat for a long time. God only knows what he was doing there. Nobody can really tell me, and I'm not sure he could now, because he's had a mental decline substantially over the last 4 years. In fact, it was a real big question. The staff has been propping him up like Weekend at Bernie's or at the Biden administration. And so Kreidler's finally gone. He's leaving. And so it's the first time that seat's not been run. There hasn't been an incumbent there. And so it's a free-for-all right now. You really have two leading candidates that are running. You have Patty Cooter on the Democrat side, who would be terrible in that position. And then you have Senator Phil Fortunato, who I actually think could do a very good job in the insurance commissioner position at all, and I'd recommend anybody voting for him. These are the only two people, by the way, in that race who have raised any money at all. And so essentially, anybody else hasn't raised a dime isn't probably coming out of the primary, because those are the two who are going to be facing off with each other, most likely in the general. I think Phil has a chance. He needs to spend less time talking about his life and the personality-based elements, and I love Phil, so this is me being a positive guy. He needs to start talking about how he's directly going to save the consumer money, because the insurance rates in Washington have been jacked up, screwed up, and everybody's angry about them. Nobody who's paid for an insurance bill in the last year can possibly think that we're living in a normal world right now with the costs that are out there. And so you really got an argument that can be brought into that office, and I think the person who does the best in presenting to the largest audience about the consumer protection, consumer advocacy side of how they plan to run that office is got a really good chance of winning that race. Even though Fortunato hasn't raised anywhere near the money that Cooter has raised, I think he's got a pretty good chance there if he does a good job spreading that word. Cooter does a lot of talking about herself as well, and that makes her a weaker candidate than she might otherwise be, and whichever one probably gets across the finish line first on presenting themselves as the consumer advocate is the one that might be able to prevail at the end of the day. So that race is fairly set in stone as well. Let me think of you got a couple of races. The Attorney General race is obvious. I've done a video on this before. Pete Serrano is your only choice. But again, very similar to the OSPI race, you got a battle royale going on between Nick Brown, who's Inslee's choice for the Attorney General, and then Monica Dingra, who's a crazy leftist out of the east side of King County. And the funny thing is, she's so crazy that even the Democrats have thought that she's crazy, and so there's a real infighting going on right now. Nick Brown probably has more money and more support on the Democrat inside track, but Monica's not going away quietly, and so there's a battle going on there. I suspect that the final fight is going to be between Nick Brown and Pete Serrano. I'm a big fan of Pete's. He is the only Republican in the race, and he was endorsed by the Republican Party, but he really stands out to these other guys as far as somebody who cares about the Constitution, believes that the rule of law matters, and who wants to protect your freedom and liberty. No one else in that race is going to have that opinion or attitude, and so the AG's race is not a hard one to figure out. A couple races that people will be looking at to determine turnout models and the profile of who was depressed or not depressed to come out and vote are also relatively easy races to call, because there's only two people in the general right now, and they're going to both come through, or in the primary, and they're both going to come through in the general. But because those are partisan races, which is state treasurer and the state auditor's race, Matt Hawkins is a Republican running in the auditor's race. Sharon Hannock is running in the state treasurer's race. Sharon Hannock's running against Pellicati, who is the incumbent treasurer. She ran for this office once in 2012. It was actually the largest person to get the write-in vote. She got a write-in vote in the primary so many years ago, and got on the ballot in the general, and got in the mid-40s, low 40s, I think, 43%, something like that, with no money, and it was a quick campaign. But it's fun to see her come back and run again for this race. I would love to see her in there versus Pellicati, of course. But so people are going to be looking at that primary number and seeing, does the number, the percentages, is she high 40s or low 40s? And that's going to determine how much money they're able to raise going into the general. That's just a realistic assessment based on historical data. The other race in the state auditor's race, Pat McCarthy is the incumbent right now, Democrat. And the auditor's office has kind of gotten quiet, and mostly rubber stamp operation that does its best to make sure they don't find any corruption in government. And good people work in the state auditor's office. I interact with a lot of them and have over time. I don't think there's good leadership at the top, but Matt Hawkins is out of Spokane, an activist I've known for many years, running against them. And again, both of these races, because there's only a Republican and a Democrat in the primary, the vote percentages they get are kind of a bellwether measurement, at least statewide, on participation. There aren't other people in the race to kind of mix up those numbers. So it's easy for conservative-leaning people to know who to vote for in those races, but it's also interesting just from a wonkish standpoint to see what kind of is there a tendency to have lower voter turnout or not? Which districts is that going to be in? Can you take the matchbacks and actually figure out, calculate partisan affiliation of the unaffiliated, things like that. So that's what they'll be doing, and those two races will probably be two of the ones that they use to measure that. Another race that's kind of similar to the AG's race is the Secretary of State race, because you have relatively new and pretty young Republican Whitaker running. And he's the only Republican in that race. The party did get behind him and sponsor him. But Hobbs, Democrat Hobbs, who's the incumbent right now, it's pretty much likely to be those two people to come out of the primary. Whitaker's going to try to get the highest vote count that he can. There's a couple other people that are in there, so that'll mix up the numbers, so it won't be a pure comparison to see how turnout model exactly is going to affect it. But that's another race that's relatively easy to look at and see who's there. That brings you to the governor's race. It's the last statewide race that I'll talk about, and then I'll jump into these questions. And so the governor's race essentially boils down to the same four people that I had talked about earlier. And that is obviously Ferguson, Angel of Darkness, and the worst human in the race running right now, current Attorney General for 12 years, and I've done plenty of videos about his corruption and what makes him a particularly bad guy. He's actively trying to bribe voters right now with his chicken tuna check settlements and extortion schemes that he's been running to take those settlement cash dollars and then spread them out in randomly assorted and incompetently managed fashion, but in a way to influence the voting in some significant way in his direction. He's still not that popular on the Democrat side, which is why you also have Mark Mullet, a Democrat who's a state senator out of the Issaquah area, running. He's from the 5th legislative district. Now, Mark Mullet, I like Mark. I totally disagree with him on a certain policy set, but what makes Mark unique for Democrats, especially in the Senate, he was probably the last one in there, especially that Hobbs went over to the Secretary of State's race. I think Mullet's the last Democrat left in Washington State in the state Senate who actually believes that math is real. And that makes him quite a unique person and a radical, which is why Inslee tried to take him out of office 4 years ago. Mullet's challenge is that every survey, even though he spent about $1 million so far, has shown him in this very small niche sort of environment of about a 5 to 6% sort of range at best. And the question, that's not enough to really erode Ferguson's lead on the Democrat side of things, even though they're both Democrats. The challenge that I think Mullet has is a lot of the people that are voting for him are Republican, and so who like what he has to say. And he's a good guy, and he's comes across normal and not caught up in a lot of the wokester sort of world views that you're going to find elsewhere. And so because of that, that makes that race a little bit more interesting. But generally, most insiders know Ferguson's coming through with a big war chest and probably not even that concerned about the primary anymore now that the other two Bob Fergusons aren't in after they weren't going to be on the ballot. Then that leaves you the two Republicans that are leading the way, and again, a field of 28 candidates total. Obviously, Dave Reichert is the Republican candidate who has a lot more money and raised a lot more money and higher name recognition and tends to do better in the polling. And you have Semi Bird, who's been running a lot longer and has some pretty strong ties into some of the grassroots around the state of Washington, particularly in Eastern Washington, Clark County, a little bit up in Whatcom. I mean, I've seen, because I know a lot of the activists, so I'm pretty familiar with his support network, but he's struggled to raise enough money to get his name out there much wider. And of course, the cult of personality problems that we always have tend to gel most aggressively around governor races. It always does. I saw it 4 years ago. I saw it 4 years before that. It's how things tend to operate. And so people tend to wave the flag of their respective candidates within their party fight that they have right now. And so the big fight is what percentage of the Republican vote that comes out here for the primary is going to vote for Reichert versus Semi. And most people have already made up their mind, I think, in that decision process. But, the polling doesn't look great for semi right now. It just doesn't. Now, he said that the polls are not real and that they're fake or that they aren't realistic. And listen, I'm a critic of the polls at times too, but the delta seems to be pretty large there. So most insiders are predicting right now that Reichert and Ferguson are the most likely people to come out of the scrum of the primary next Tuesday. We'll see, Tuesday night, a week from today. And that's probably your battle for the governor's race. The question really that people will be looking at, insiders will be looking at, is not so much the percentages, how much votes that Byrd gets or how much votes Reichert gets, but they're really going to be looking at how many votes Ferguson gets. If Ferguson gets a smaller percentage of vote than he's polling at right now, then he's in trouble, and he just is. And it's reasonable to believe that despite the bad blood right now, that a decent percentage of those Byrd voters would probably end up voting for Reichert, because I can't see him voting for Ferguson, and probably a decent percentage of the mullet vote would also vote for Reichert, conceivably, in that scenario. And Ferguson is going to be going just down the rabbit hole of hard left in many ways. And I know he's trying to pretend like he cares about law and order now, but nobody believes that anymore. I mean, I'm sure you have some people from Evergreen State College and maybe Seattle that believe that, but nobody really believes it. There's no evidence that he's ever cared about law and order until now. Suddenly he's realizing, according to polling, that he's in trouble that way. So it's an interesting race that's going on right now. Nothing I say is going to change anybody's mind as to which Republican candidate you're voting for, and most of the viewers in this channel are going to vote for probably the Republican, who you're going to vote for in that race. But that's the overall view that people are looking at is what are these numbers going to look like? Because a primary is essentially a super expensive advanced poll on where things are going towards the general. And there's a number of factors in the general election this year that are going to make a big difference. Things like the initiatives on the ballot and the president, obviously. Those two elements are going to totally change turnout models for the actual general. Now I'm getting back to your questions, guys, and I'm sorry I did that. Let's see. She's so horrific. Why would anybody vote for her? Ridiculous. Aren't any better options for Dem candidates? I'm assuming that you're talking about Kamala Harris. Anyway, we'll see how that happens. Can somebody explain why Trump might succeed in draining the swamp this time? I was disappointed from my 2016 vote as he didn't fully deliver, and I'm skeptical about his future success. Well, good question. I think that's the same question many people have asked. It's a question of whether anybody can at this point in time, and could you actually downsize government fast enough and aggressively enough? From what I've been told by people who are working on the inside, they claim that they're coming in with a much better team and a more prepared team with the recognition of exactly the kind of forces they're up against. We'll see. We will see what happens. Thoughts on the 18th, John? This is a good question. No, I don't right now. I'm sorry I didn't come prepared with some analysis for the Legislative District 18, which is actually down here in Clark County, part of it. And the 18th is actually one of the battleground ledge districts for the state of Washington. Overall, I would anticipate that the Republicans have a pretty decent chance of picking up some seats in the state house. But the 18th is one of their weak spots. They actually have some strong opportunities in the 10th, which is in kind of Whidbey Island, and the 24th potentially on the peninsula. That's been kind of this, great white whale that people are trying to get for at least 10 years now, because it seems it keeps trending a little bit more Republican over time, but it hasn't done that flip over that you saw on the 35th and 19th, which is Southwest Washington later on. The other place I would say is there's an off chance you might, depend on voter turnout models, in the 42nd. You got at least one race up there, I think, that's the Republicans could pick up again. They've held those seats recently. The 5th, because of the redistricting, which is the Issaquah area, got Enumclaw added to it, which really added a fairly substantial increase in the conservative nature of that district. And so the Republicans do have some pretty solid candidates running out there, and there's Magendas being one of them, and he's not the only one. They may be able to pick up some seats in the 5th. I actually feel like the 30th has a pretty good shot, but the 18th is one of the risky districts. That's where people are worried. So anyway. Here's a question. Do you think Arizona voters like me should cast their ballots early to avoid delays in counting, or is voting in the same day more effective? I don't have a super strong opinion of that anymore, provided you have a decent voter observation process. If you can guarantee your ballot's in there, at least you get a better chance of it being counted. I'm less familiar with how Arizona does their counting, though, than Washington. So I'm probably not the best person for you to ask about that. Holy cow, guys, there's a ton of questions, and I'm way behind here. Here's I received a mailing from the Republican Party with their choices for all ballot choices. Are you familiar with it? And should I trust their choices? I am familiar with it. And if you haven't done any other homework, it's probably not a bad one to go over. I haven't seen all of them. I don't know how deep they go into that, but most of, I'm sure that there's got to be some positions that they didn't, I don't think they officially made a choice in the lieutenant governor's race, because you had two Republicans that jumped in kind of late in the day after their convention. And, where I think you might see some Republican voters stray from the recommended list may be in the governor's race. The Reichert was not an endorsed candidate, and it could be in the Public Lands Commissioner race because Jamie Herrera Butler was not an endorsed candidate. Sue Peterson was an endorsed candidate, but I can see a lot of people potentially in those races who are Republican-leaning donors vote differently than the Republican recommendation. But this is the first time the Republican Party has actually done this in this way, after having the convention the way they did and some of the controversies that surround it. It'll be interesting to see if where it goes. So I am going to jump down. I'm going to try to hit these questions, guys, because I know I spent too much time talking about political candidates there. Michael Case, in your opinion, why hasn't anyone tried to use the HABA Act against Ferguson and Inslee? HABA Act? I don't know that I know what you're talking about. Hatch Act, is that what maybe you meant the Hatch Act. And if you are talking about the Hatch Act, I don't think that there's a clear applicability with that law in this case, but let me know. Oh, Hobbs Act. You did say Hobbs Act, okay. Michael, I don't know. I don't know if there is. So sorry, you got a question that I may not be able to answer very well for you, so I'm not totally sure that I'm familiar. I probably understand it. Maybe I don't know it by that name, but I am not aware of any ability to use the Hobbs Act specifically against Fergie or Inslee. Let's see. Here's a question right here. I think my mom is a lifelong Democrat, and I asked her today if she'd vote for Bobby or Dave Reichert in the general election. She said probably Dave Reichert. That's interesting. I'd be interested in where you're from, because if you're in King County, my suspicion is that there's enough history with Dave Reichert out there that may have an impact. Your diligence is unparalleled. Well, thank you. That's nice. You don't even have to send me nice statements, but I appreciate that. Anyway, hope that's helpful. Part 2, do you think this could be a common theme here in Washington State for the general election, and how many crossover votes from independents and moderates will be needed to win? Well, Ben, generally, the rule of thumb is in Washington State, you need... they're going to have, listen, the primary comes out, right? The numbers are what they are. You probably would need a increase of about 5 to 6% increase in moderate voters who shift over to Republicans, who might sometimes be going either direction. And that would probably make a pretty big difference. But I think the primary vote's going to tell us a little bit, and we'll get a sense of where we're at. So, anyway, that's how I would kind of look at that. Political question of the day, number 4. How do political systems balance the need for security with the protection of civil liberties? Where should the lines be drawn? Well, I mean, here's the thing. You have a constitution and theory that that a Bill of Rights simply identifies your natural rights that you already have, God-given natural rights. And it doesn't by itself protect them, but at least it puts it down in writing for clarity for those who seem to be confused in the future or who conveniently don't want to find them. So from a political system, that's only going to work if you have people who are both willing to be, you need at least a certain amount of honesty in government. And that's a rare commodity, my friends. So you need more of that in order to be able to pull it off and hold it together and protect your civil liberties a little bit better than they currently are doing. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. I'm trying to jump down to some of these questions because I think there were some questions down here, and I'm sorry about how much time I put into that. Okay, here's a question. Actually, Jason, you're reminding me of something because I didn't mention this earlier. Dave Larson, there's a Supreme Court race that's up for election. There's actually 3 positions that would normally be up for election this time, but 2 of them are unopposed. And so essentially there's no primary for those 2, and you're going to see them on your ballot in November with no opposition, which is unfortunate because both of them should have been opposed. But Justice Owens was retiring this year because of the constitutional requirement in Washington State that a judge who hits 75, whatever year that is, that year they have to retire and be replaced. So there's an age limit defined for judges for the Supreme Court in the Constitution right now. So she's aged out. To her credit, she didn't resign early and let Inslee appoint somebody. She decided the voters should be able to decide, which has not happened in a long time. And so there's a 4-way runoff for the Supreme Court judge race. Dave Larson is a good judge candidate for that race. Judicial candidates are always hard, but in this case, there's no doubt he's probably the only person of the 4 who believes in the Constitution, who understands the Constitution, has read the Constitution, actually been a judge and understands the legal process. Having even just one sane person on the state Supreme Court would make a huge difference in the reasoning and the logic and the debate and the arguments that go on behind the scenes that we don't hear about in how these cases are decided. We used to see that when we had Justice Sanders and Jim Johnson on the Supreme Court. And even though they were outnumbered, they frequently had substantial influence in good decisions that you saw in the Supreme Court. So we need somebody like that. Dave Larson, easily identified as the best option in that particular race, especially considering the people who are against him. But we'll see who comes out of the primary. So I forgot about that. Now back to your question. What's your thoughts on the Washington Supreme Court delay the magazine ban case ruling? Are we better off without a ruling from them? I would say right now, and it's interesting to me that they are delaying it. I don't know if they're doing it just because they're on vacation or because they want to wait till after the election. There's a lot of political considerations which probably shouldn't be there, but they are. And so that's one of the challenges that you see there. But we'll see. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the gun rights issues are going to be decided in federal court, and it's unfortunate they have to be decided in court at all. But if that's where it happens, they're more likely to come back as a result of that. I got a historical question for you. What was the significance of the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, 1961 to 89? Why? I don't know why that question gets thrown in here, but I'll answer it as best I can. Listen, the rise and significance of the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall. The rise of the Berlin Wall in 1961 was mostly significant because it was a clear identification of the weakness of communism in Eastern Germany in particular, and Eastern Berlin, where basically there was a brain drain, and all the people who had the ability were willing to try to defect to the West Side and to the American sector or the British or French sector in Berlin. What was interesting about that really was that they really did, this was a big churn that was going on, and you'd already had the 1949 Berlin airlift that occurred in Europe after the communists of Eastern Germany really tried to kind of block off, with a lot of Soviet help at the time, tried to block off access and essentially by default get Berlin, and so when they failed in that effort, and then it became a bigger problem for them because they were losing all these defectors were coming across the sector, they had to put the wall up in order to stop people from crossing. And so it became a symbol, of course, of how communism's so awesome that you have to put up walls to hold your own people in. In America, we have to put up a wall to keep people from coming in, but if you want to leave, go for it. But it was totally the exact opposite there. I was in college when the wall came down, and I just started college when it happened. And I remember what a big deal that really was, and the complete change in mindset and the collapse of the Soviet socialist sort of system that existed at the time. It still, of course, exists in American government and on our college campuses and a number of other places that they need a new generation that doesn't have any sense of history that can come back and try to experiment with the stupid bad ideas that failed last time. But I think it's pretty significant, and I think the Berlin Wall in many ways was just a symbol when Reagan went out there and he said, tear down this wall, right? It was really something that his advisors were fearful of, but it really became a statement that was heard and put pressure, I think, between that and Chernobyl and the Soviet Union and some other things that had happened, that it really helped push and change the world that we knew at that time. A lot of other people keep throwing a lot of stuff out here, commenting to each other. Okay, here we go. And so, guys, just so you know, if you say @We the Governed, then I'm more likely to be able to spot it in just the mix of everything else. Let's see. I don't know if this is a question. No, I don't have purple hair, but thanks for asking. Let's see. Gregorius Greg, do you think the presidential campaign will bring more liberals out in the state of Washington? I actually don't. The question is, if it's demoralizing enough, will it reduce the turnout? That's the question I have. Not so much in Seattle, and I think I did a video where I mentioned this last week, but I would look in some of the kind of more rural districts, 42nd, the 10th, maybe the 18th a little bit, definitely the 5th and the 7th. I would see if it changes the vote turnout models that you'd have there, that they would project for how Democrats would turn out in different races. I don't know how effective Republicans are with their vote modeling. My experience generally indicates that if the way the left does it and their analysis of voter profiles and data sets and predictions and surveys and all that, if they do it at a college level, then my sense is Republicans do it at about a kindergarten level. So that's really the difference. I remember when I ran in 2010 for the most exciting office in local government you could have, which was the assessor's office in Thurston County. Brand new, didn't know anything, jumped into the race. I was frustrated with a different problem that I had at the assessor's office, and that's kind of the world that got me back into the political process. And some Democrats on the other side were surprised by the results that I had in the primary, and it freaked them out. And the reason was I was 5 points higher than all of their math models had projected, and they couldn't figure out why. I understand why now, looking back on it and what I was doing. I also know how I could have done a lot better, but it threw them off, and they actually had that knowledge and information to even have that opinion. The Republicans had no idea. They couldn't tell. It was always a mystery and a surprise on election night for the Republicans. But that was kind of interesting to me that they had that level and detailed knowledge. Now, that's 15 years ago. Nowadays, they are 14 years ago, I guess now, but nowadays they're much more skilled and capable, and there's a lot more tools that give them a lot more information. And to be fair, the Republicans are better now than they were then too, but it's kind of like this. If you're already up this skill, there's a big gap in analysis and voter analysis usually between the two of them. Let's see, Thunderstriker, 2 final questions before you go. Could Harris concede before Trump hits 270? Hillary did it when Trump had only 230. Sure, she can. Yeah, anybody can concede if they want. I never totally understand why a candidate early concedes like that. It doesn't seem to be super useful, but she could. I just don't know why it would matter. Will the impact of January 6th, Hunter Biden, or even a dark horse candidate like Thomas Matthew Crooks or Mac Jones determine the outcome of the upcoming election? Actually, I don't think any of that's going to make too much of a change. Part of the reason why dark horse candidates aren't going to matter too much right now is just the fact that your getting on the ballots in a lot of states has ended. You know, those dates are closing. You know, you're not going to be able to pull it off. So I'm just not sure on that. Late to the conversation, Alma, thank you for jumping in, and I'll answer a few more of these questions here. But do you see any issues with election integrity in Washington? Do you see Washington ever going back to paper ballots? Well, Alma, just for clarity, I see a lot of issues with election integrity in Washington State. And also for clarity, we are probably the most heavily paper balloted state in America because we're 100% mail-in, which means there's a paper for everything. The question usually that people have is hand counting or same-day counting rather than dragging it out over a long period of time. There's a number of reforms you could have in Washington, even short of the optimal. I think mail-in balloting and mail-in voting is terrible. I think it's much better to have in-person, show ID, and vote at a polling station with physical paper ballots, not electronic systems. And I think that you do it by the precinct level. The count isn't crazy. It's easy to manage, easy to supervise, very difficult to commit fraud in any widespread sort of way under those settings. Very difficult even for an organized group to come in and commit fraud in an organized setting. Right now, we have a black box voting, which is mystery magical events that occur where people can't go in and look or audit effectively or transparently enough. Not everywhere, but enough places that it's substantially concerning. Specifically, King County. I think Snohomish County has some weaknesses. But even before that, everybody focuses on the auditors or offices and what's going on when they're actually getting the ballots. The biggest problem I think that Washington genuinely has, which is similar to what Florida, Texas is discovering, Maryland, some of these other states around the country, is fluffed up voter rolls that are stuffed with a bunch of people that shouldn't be on the voter rolls in the first place. It's not so much about dead people voting. There's some of that, but that's not the worst. The most significant problem that we have is the registration of everybody, multiple times, oftentimes, repeatedly, in all these different settings, systems that don't really work very well. And so you've got millions of extra ballots probably out there, hundreds of thousands at least, extra ballots are floating around with no chain of custody and no idea what's actually going on. And so when I've been told by farm workers who aren't U.S. citizens, but apparently were all registered to vote, that they could sell their ballots for $30 a couple years ago, that concerns me. Somebody's not buying them just for the heck of it. They're buying them because they have nefarious plans for those ballots. And this is where I think the voter roll cleanup could be a fairly significant benefit in our state. Also, if Trump becomes president, he needs to allow us the ability to audit our own voter rolls by simply providing us with a list of everybody in the state of Washington that has student visa, green card visa, H-1B visa. They're here legally. Great, we love them. These are people we want here, Microsoft employees, some of these are really wealthy people, but they're here on some green card or some of their visas. That's great, but they're not, they're tourist visas, whatever it is, but they're not U.S. citizens. And they frequently are registered to vote against their will. I have been approached by people from so many different countries, Canada, Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, China, who are Mexico and Venezuela. They're registered to vote, even though they aren't U.S. citizens. And they know they can't vote. And they've tried to get their name off the voter rolls. And the auditors they won't do it. They won't remove them from the voter rolls. Now, they don't vote. To the best, I haven't found conclusive evidence that those people that approach me have had somebody else vote their ballot. But who knows? And those are the people I know. And because I can't get the master list, which I tried to get during the Trump administration, and they wouldn't give it to me, or anybody else when we looked at it, under a FOIA request, we should be able to get that and then cross-reference it with the voter rolls and easily clean up our voter rolls. That's one simple way to avoid potential fraud. Easy, not hard. Now, the Social Security master death list, we can get that, but there's been a lot of defective data on that list. It's pretty ineffective. I'm not confident you can use that really efficiently. The NCOA updates, the national change of address stuff at the post office, that's helpful for managing the voters that move or multi-state voting, things like that goes on. But the one thing that people should remember, and this is, you got to get over your cult of personality kind of thing, but if the Trump administration is going to do anything to fix voter roll cleanup, one thing they need to do immediately, and they have total authority and control over this, is to let us have access to that data so we can transparently review non-U.S. citizens who have registered to vote in our state. And I think that cleaning that up is not the total solution, but it's a start. So there's things like that can easily be done. I'm shocked to hear that Kamala is doing so well in the swing states compared to Biden. Is this true? Thoughts on this? Who knows? It's all hyped up. And anytime there's change, Biden's so bad. You've got a guy that hit rock bottom so bad that Barack Obama apparently threatened him with the 25th Amendment removal from office because he's obviously was seen, Parkinson's and fallen off a cliff. So the Democrats' quest for power was clearly falling apart. So they needed anybody, any warm body, and she was the least problematic. And so put yourself in their shoes. That's an amazing change. I don't know that how much of it's actually real at the end of the day because she didn't generate a lot of strong support when she was running for president the first time. I don't know what's changed that would actually make it any easier. or her path any easier, I should say. What do you know about Eastern Washington joining Idaho? Could this happen? Well, no, not anytime soon. There is a movement, just like there is in Oregon or Northern California, just like there's a movement in Eastern King County to break away from Western King County, right? These movements have popped up before, but the legal hurdles and challenges you have to go through to make it happen, there's other things that have to change before that could happen. So we should... it's interesting. I think it's totally worth exploring different ideas like that. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Let's see. Here's a question. Can any of the voting system issues be resolved with ballot initiatives? And the answer is yes. So there are paths down that way that could be utilized to make an impact. But there's a lot of wonkish discussions going on right now about what that is. Let's see how these initiatives do in November. I'm sure it terrifies the political insider class, the fact that they're going to be on the ballot. So with that, guys, I'm going to wrap up this. I know there's some of the questions that I couldn't get to. There was just too many, and I went too long on candidates. But I'm making up for the fact that I was ineffective at getting a decent video prepped up in time to record it this week for my predictions and recommendations for for the primary next week. So I'm hoping this was relatively helpful, and it fills in the gap, sort of, in not having that video out there. If you got any other topics that you want me to cover for future video work, I am trying to find a way to get higher volume video output. Some of that's just structural problems, and a lot of it's just my fault in not prepping a lot more of this in advance. But government never has solved anything, and it probably won't solve too many things in the future, but it's really good at making more problems. So if you want to make a difference, you got to show up. You got to be out there. I end all my videos with that statement, and I believe it's true. If you haven't voted yet, make sure you vote. And frankly, just go around and verify your neighbors and friends and other people you have that they voted, and make sure they have. If they haven't, help them know who you would recommend, who they want to vote for, and if they're worried about taking that ballot anywhere or it's sitting on their counter, help them get it delivered. You are allowed to do that in Washington State. We allow ballot harvesting, which is essentially the process of, if they fill it out and sign it and they give you the ballot, you can take that down to the county auditor and drop it off right there. And do whatever you can to help improve the profile of what's going on right now, and do your best to reach out to your neighbor and your community, see what's going on, what the needs are, and get to know more people. You don't change government or your culture alone or your society alone. You have to be a team, and growing is a more effective path to political success than shrinking yourself with a purity contest. So hope all's well. It was good to see, basically get a lot of questions, a lot of interaction going on right now. Sorry again for the segue into a lot of the candidates, but it seemed the appropriate time to do it. Let me know what you think about my top 10 list video that I'm going to put out shortly. And with that, I'm going to close it for today. We'll see you next.